Uniquely.
Uniquely. Uniquely.
Uniquely.
Uniquely.
Uniquely.
Uniquely. Uniquely.
Uniquely.
Issaquah.
Hello and welcome to Uniquely Issaquah, a podcast about the people, places, and things that make Issaquah unique. I'm your host, Timothy Smith, and joining us again is Erica Maniez, the director of Issaquah's History Museums, for part 2 of Issaquah's history. Welcome back, Erica.
Thanks a lot, Tim.
In part 1, we left off just after the coal boom, and it kind of brings us in the early 1900s time frame, as I remember. So I guess we should just kind of pick up where we left off in the story.
Sure. All right. So when last we left our little town of Issaquah, it was around 1925, and so the last major operating coal mine, the Grand Ridge Mine, had just closed down. So for people who lived here who'd been involved in the coal mining industry, they had to decide whether they wanted to stay here in Issaquah with their roots and find something else to do to make money, or they had to move somewhere else where coal mining was still happening. So a lot of people moved down to Centralia after that. And so the town sort of settled into this middle period between the coal boom and then the post-World War II population boom, where the population of Issaquah really kind of wavered in between about 700 and about 900 people. That's between about 1920 and 1945. So this is a really interesting time period in Issaquah's past because the town sort of pulled in on itself and became very tight-knit. There weren't a ton of reasons to move to Issaquah. There weren't the coal mines to go work in anymore, so there wasn't a huge draw. Mm-hmm. So the number of people moving in and out of the community was fairly small.
Less
so
transient.
Yeah.
You know, like before you'd get somebody to come work the mines, and then once it was done, they'd move out,
right.
That sort of thing. Or
yeah.
when it was booming, we'd come in, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So things kind of reached a real stasis in that time period. And the two major jobs that people had, or the two major occupations, were dairy farming and logging and working in lumber mills. So logging and lumber mill work had been pretty common on the east side since 1889. So that was sort of the root of the east side logging and lumber industry. Why 1889? Well, that was the year that they had the Great Fire in Seattle. So the first white settlers arrived in Seattle in the 1850s, 1860s. And so Seattle Part 1, Version 1, was all built out of lumber that was nearby. Mm-hmm. After the city burned and they had to go back and do a lot of rebuilding, of course, they'd used all the lumber that was nearby and they had to go farther afield. So that's when more widespread logging started happening over on the east side. Mm-hmm. And some of the small communities in our area, like High Point, Preston, Monaghan, which actually no longer exists, all of those little towns grew up around mills or logging operations.
During that time period, but Issaquah wasn't its focus. It was coal, right? Well,
that was mostly. I would say if it weren't for the coal, Issaquah would have been known for its
logging.
Yeah. It was fairly widespread. It just wasn't. It wasn't the hot commodity that coal was. It's sort of like, I don't know, I guess it'd be kind of like comparing logging and lumber to gas and oil today. There's still a lot of logging and lumbering. We know about it. We know it's important, but it's not as connected to our daily life in the way that gasoline is. I mean, we need it to get to work. And so it was sort of similar, I think, comparing coal to logging and lumber.
Okay.
So the interesting thing about logging and lumber is that there are dozens of different jobs you could have. You might have worked at a shingle mill or a planing mill, and those might have been down in town or near civilization. Or you might have worked up in a logging camp. So there were logging camps up in the woods, kind of all over the area. One of the biggest was the Wood and Iverson operations, and those were over on Tiger Mountain. And here's one of the little-known historic facts. There's the name for the place where the parasailers go sailing off. It's Poo-Poo Point. Right. And there are a lot of questions about why that
I've always wondered.
Was given. Yeah,
I've always wondered.
It's actually fairly contemporary. I think the name was given by Harvey Manning in the 80s, but the poo-poo in question is the sound that the steam whistle makes, going poo-poo. and that's what you would hear up in these
The steam whistle from...
The steam donkey.
Oh, the steam donkey.
Yeah.
So
steam donkeys are sort of hard to explain verbally, but I'll try.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd encourage anybody who's curious about what a steam donkey actually looks like to go check out the one outside the depot. There's also one in an enclosure over by the Trails House. So these were big steam-driven machines that basically were used to pull large logs into a central point so that then they could be loaded on rail cars and sent down to a depot or somewhere else to send.
So it was just a machine way of, you chop down
Right.
a tree, it's on the side of a mountain, you got to get it up. So it was a way to pull it and get it.
Right.
I see that.
So the name Hoo-Poo Point came from the sound that these steam donkeys would make. So they were steam powered, so the whistle sounded just like a train whistle, boo-poo. And the whistle was used to warn the guys that were working that the steam donkey was getting ready to fire up. So there was a kid that would sit up on top of the steam donkey, and it was his job to look around and make sure everything was clear before he turned it on. And he would sound the whistle to let everybody know that they had to get out of the way.
So you could hear this, probably hear it throughout the valley.
Yeah.
So all day you'd hear poo poo, and that's the name Poo Poo
Right.
Point. Yeah, that's pretty. That's interesting. That's good.
Yeah.
I was always curious because it was an odd name. So
Yeah.
That's good to know.
That's one thing that the kids always ask about because their first guess is that it's scatological.
yes, it has something to do with the restroom activity.
Very disappointing to them.
But probably a history fact they won't forget because
Right.
it logs into their heads somehow.
Yeah. It's like showing them the jail, and they always want to know where they had to go to the bathroom, and then you get to explain chamber pots.
Oh.
And that's always a big
Horrifying.
That's the grossest thing you've ever heard.
That's right.
It's so funny. We realize how sanitized we've become as a culture and how used to pretty smells and things we are. So I'll show kids old-fashioned soap that's handmade, and it just smells like lye, and they think that's the most disgusting thing ever. It's
That's so funny.
Yeah. So in addition to lumber and logging, the other main occupation was dairy farming. So there are a number of dairy farms in the area, and if you weren't working in lumber and logging and you weren't working on a dairy farm, chances were good that you were working at the Alpine Dairy. So the Alpine Dairy actually started out in 1909 with a different name, and today, of course, it has become Dairy Gold. But for a time period in between, it was the Alpine Dairy, and it was one of the biggest employers in town. And they did a lot of sponsorship, a lot of team sponsorships. And one of the biggest things they did was to support and sponsor the Alpine Dairy football team. Which we'll have to talk about at some point, because these guys were amazing. And the Alpine Dairy supplied them with uniforms, and I think they helped put lights on over in the field and that kind of thing. So Alpine Dairy was sort of one of the biggest employers. So if you were going to work for a company, that's pretty much who you worked for. So in this intervening time period, when you don't have a lot of people moving in and out, you've got a group of, it's 700 people. Maybe 50 different families, maybe more, maybe less.
Right.
But everybody eventually is connected to each other by some tie, whether it's marriage or
employment of some sort. Or,
yeah. I mean, everybody. Well, if you think about it, I went to a high school where there were 127 people in my graduating class, so I knew every single person,
right?
And maybe I didn't talk to them, but I kind of knew who their parents were, and you kind of had that context for everybody.
Yeah.
So that was what it was like living in Issaquah. When you think about it, say 1,000 people, that's not too many people. I mean, some of us have that many, friends on our Facebook pages.
Right. So 1,000 people. What time frame are we in right now? We're like.
That's pretty much from about 1920 up until probably the mid-50s. In the early 50s, it finally hit 1,000, but it actually went back and forth kind of between 700 and 1,000 there for about 25, 35 years.
So basically for a generation,
yes.
Issaquah was just a small-knit agricultural town, basically, with fits and starts of logging.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And nothing's changing. It's just kind of like a small little town.
Yeah.
Takes you how long to get to Seattle?
Well, this was before the bridge,
right.
So you were still. So this is another interesting thing that happened in 1925. There stopped being passenger service from the depot.
Oh, okay.
So the trains still went through town. They would still stop and you could load and unload freight. But by that time period, cars were starting to become more widespread. So that's not to say that an average family would have had a car in their driveway.
Right.
But it was possible if you had a lot of money to purchase a car. And if you were an enterprising businessman, you could purchase a large car and you could establish some kind of mass transit.
Okay.
So that's what they did. They would have these huge cars and they called them auto stages. So kind of a takeoff from the stagecoach because you were still traveling in stages. So you could pick up one of these auto stages. There were 2 different places downtown in Issaquah that you could do that. And so they had 2 different departures and 2 different arrivals daily. If you took the train, there was 1 departure, 1 arrival. If you took the auto stage, it was actually cheaper and slightly shorter than taking the train.
Oh, okay.
You did have to do some transferring. So you'd get on the auto stage in downtown Issaquah, and that would take you to the Newport Ferry Landing, which is roughly where the Factoria Mall is today.
Okay.
So only farther out and actually on the water. And so then people would hop off the auto stage. They'd get on a ferry boat that would take them across the lake, and they would get off in Leshai, which is a little south of downtown Seattle.
And were those little small ferries, like the was that, mosquito fleet type of thing?
They
Okay,
were probably something of that size.
Okay.
So, and then you'd hop on a streetcar and be in downtown Seattle. So
in the
it's less than 2 hours.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
It
in the
is.
1920s, you're saying that basically so the person who ran the stage, not stagecoach, the auto stage, excuse me. So it was just a person, right? And the people that ran the ferry was just a person, right? So these were all like independent contractors,
pretty much.
But they had formed some sort of loose form of transit from the east side to Seattle. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting to look at how people got around then because they weren't, municipally driven. Or
right. So I mean, you had to count on them showing up, right? But it's interesting that it would only take about 2 hours to get from Issaquah to Seattle in the 1920s. It's pretty slick, actually.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and there are many times when I'm driving across the bridge when I have to think about what the amount of time it would have taken in 1940 right after the bridge opened.
Right.
I'm sure many of us who commute over the bridge would be horrified and also inspired.
Yes.
Yeah.
At the same time.
And I think the thing, kind of getting back to what I was talking about with small communities and getting to know everybody, I've heard this from people who grew up kind of in that time period. They'll say, you couldn't misbehave or, you couldn't sass somebody on the street because by the time you got home, your mom would know about it. They knew exactly who you were and where to call. Somebody else told me once a story about how they just moved to the community and they were complaining to a neighbor about a repair person or something. Well, of course the neighbor was related to the repair person and they got very offended. So that was the kind of thing. You had to be really careful what you said to who because really, everyone was related to everybody.
Yeah, it was a true case of Mayberry.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, I don't say that in a weird way that Issaquah was a bunch of inbreeds, but when you start tracing people's in-law relationships and cousin relationships and people did divorce and get remarried. We have this idea that everything was perfect before the 60s and nobody got divorced, but divorce was relatively common.
Okay.
I used to be surprised at the number of people I was researching who I would find had second and third marriages, and now it really doesn't surprise me that much anymore. People died, marriage was different. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so multiple marriages and step siblings and stuff were much more common, I think, than we tend to assume now.
Right. You think back then, the nuclear families just stayed together no matter what, through better or worse, but it sounds like there was some sort of divorcing, But we were the Wild West, so.
Yes, yeah. And even after you did divorce somebody in a town like Issaquah, you were still going to bump into them.
True.
So you had to figure out kind of how you were going to negotiate that.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
And yeah, it is interesting. I often wonder. I've heard it's something that people are kind of sensitive to talking about, so it's difficult to get information about it. Hey, why don't you tell me about the most painful period in your family's past? When you got divorced. Mm-hmm. If you got divorced from somebody in town, you were probably going to continue to bump into them and see them, so you kind of had to figure out how you were going to deal with that. But that could get really problematic for some people, and that's when the whole tight-knit community thing can work against you. Because I know of at least one situation involved with city government where a person who was involved in the town government at that time was going through a messy divorce, and the family of his ex-wife was very angry, and he basically decided that he needed to step off the council and move a little farther out of town just because it was too turbulent.
Right.
So those kinds of things did make much bigger waves in Issaquah. Something that would cause a small scandal or a small rift in a larger city could be a really big deal here because everybody did know everybody so well.
Yeah. Yeah, and that lasted for a long time.
Yeah, Yeah.
So what changed it? I mean, why did Issaquah go from 1,000 people to start increasing in population?
Yeah, well, the story of Issaquah has always sort of been about a combination of transportation and then what that transportation makes possible. So with in the case of Issaquah, it was the construction of Highway 10 and the opening of the first bridge over Lake Washington. So that is what really opened Issaquah up to being a place that you could live in and commute to Seattle back and forth.
Okay.
So the 1940 census just became available about 3 years ago. They hold on to those for 72 years, and then they release them. So when the 1940 census was released, it was interesting to be able to look at this period in Issaquah, because this is before the bridge, right before World War II, right before a lot of other stuff started changing. And I think my assumption had always sort of been, well, Issaquah grew after, in part because people moved here to live here and work for Boeing. I was really interested to look at the 1940 census to find that there were already about a dozen people living in and around Issaquah who worked for Boeing.
Oh, wow.
So the population growth started trickling in even before...
there was an easy transportation way to get here.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So that did start, that trend did start a little bit earlier than we previously thought. But with the combination of this increased transportation around 1940, not too much change for a while because everybody was really distracted by World War II. That was really taking up a lot of everybody's sort of collective consciousness. But after World War II, some of the things that we think about as coming to fruition in the 50s, those trends really started in the late 40s. So you see a lot of people moving out of cities and into suburban areas. Seattle's population after World War II actually dropped. And it has just now, within the past decade, come up again to the point that it was before World War II.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's hard to believe.
Yeah.
That's an interesting fact. So because let's see, what is it, about 500,000 people live in Seattle now?
I think it's more than that.
More than that, maybe 600,000. So are you saying that in the 50s it was that 500,000 people, or no?
It was smaller. Well, it was larger before World War II. And during the 1940s, people started moving out. Right. And the city actually shrank in size. Right. So, the population of Seattle actually was decreased. Right, and then, it's taken a while to get back up to where it was. Right. That's the thing that's amazing, is that it was at such a high rate, and it's just gotten back in the last, mid-90s or something like that. Or whenever. Well, again, and this is the automobile made it possible. Right. So, so it's sort of funny now that we're looking back at this from 60-some years later and thinking, God, I wish we had better mass transit. Right. So we kind of did this to ourselves. Yeah, that's funny. So this was the shift to having a car, living in the suburbs, having the best of both worlds, having your picket fence and your golden retriever, and having a nice place for your family to have space and all of this starts sort of folding in with kind of the American dream.
Right.
So, and there are some materials we have in our collection from the time period that the Issaquah Chamber was actually trying to attract people out into the area. Mm-hmm. And so they had these great brochures talking about what a fabulous place Issaquah was, and talking about the churches and the schools. And the maps had all these great little cartoons on them with people saying things like, oh, what fresh spring water, or what clean air, or room for homes all around the lake, and little pictures of girls milking cows, and they were just sort of selling this very pastoral, idyllic image, and people bought it. And so after World War II, people started moving out here and buying property, and the community began to grow. And it was slow at first. It wasn't really until, I'd say, between 1960 and 1970, the population of Issaquah almost tripled.
Okay.
So that was probably the big decade for people noticing change.
Right.
So a couple of the things that Highway 10 did that sort of accelerated future change in Issaquah, it broke apart some of the family farms that were in that area. So Highway 10 followed roughly the path of I-90 today. It was smaller and it was narrower, so it curved more and didn't follow the exact footprint. But this was a 2-lane highway now, and it was cutting through people's cow pastures.
Right.
So, and they tried to do some mitigating factors. I think one of the farms had like a tunnel under the freeway that they would lead the cows through. But, the bottom line is this just made things a little more difficult. And it also made the property in this area a little more valuable as, this sort of supply and demand thing starts happening.
Right.
So,
was there a story about why, and maybe it's just the topography of the fact that Highway 10 and 90 went straight through the middle of the valley instead of maybe trying to hug one of the mountains? I mean,
there was a lot of political wrangling over the path that the highway took, and I don't know the details about it, but I know that there were 2 or 3 different plans, and there was a lot of emotion attached to the different plans because, of course, each plan change somebody else's life.
Right.
So I don't know enough about the details of that, but yeah, I mean, it would have been similar, to the bypass struggle that we had just a few years ago.
Yeah. That's what blinked into my head is like, how was that when the be interesting being a fly on the wall during that process.
Yeah.
But
and Seattle has its same stories about the process of putting, like I-90 through and changing a lot of the community where that end of the bridge and freeway went through, changed things, and left a lot of people without a home and having to move to a different area.
Right.
So I don't know as much about the details of the wrangling, but it did start changing people's lives. And one of the interesting things as we start kind of moving into the period where Issaquah is beginning to develop, I'd always looked at the property value as the carrot that kind of encouraged farmers to sell their property. And when we did our oral history project a few years ago, Rob Pickering said some really interesting things about that time period because he was actively farming then. And he talked a lot about the USDA regulations that were coming into play. This is sort of an era, again, where we're moving from small family farms to big factory farms. And so the USDA was putting a lot more regulations in place because this starts becoming a food safety thing. So you've got big operations that are milking, hundreds or thousands of cows. So you have USDA inspectors coming in and saying things like, well, you've got this open system, but, we don't allow this anymore. You need to take all this out and go to a closed system. So that means putting in all new pipes. All this, huge infrastructure change. I think one of the other things was making sure that the floor was concrete and had vents or drains in it. So all these things that seemed ridiculous to small family farmers who'd been doing it the same way for years.
Right.
And these things just made it a lot harder for them to do what they'd been doing. And of course the idea was protecting the American public from whatever. And from there, of course, you can launch into a whole discussion about local food versus factory farming and industrial farming and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. But at the time, that was the way of the world. It was look, we want standards and this, that, and the other, and everybody saw it as a good thing. We got inspections for the first time.
Yeah.
But the small farmers got to pay the price.
Yeah.
So
it was a big shift from, and that whole time period, a lot of things about food changed. People started having access to refrigerators and freezers in their homes. So people started having more choices, where they got their milk and how long they kept it and that kind of thing. So that did continue to encourage the dairy farmers in Issaquah. Not really encourage them. They had fewer and fewer choices.
Right. So you initially thought it was land, the cost of the land, but it was a combination of both. It was a combination.
Farming was getting harder, and the land was getting more valuable, and
so it just made sense for a lot of it. It was just you know,
and we see that a lot. I think in contemporary, there's a lot of attention given to contemporary farms, and when the McBride farm up on the plateau was divided and sold off, there was a lot of buzz in the papers about that too, and it was just one of those things where the property taxes become too high and it's just not feasible anymore. And a lot of people expressed sadness about that. But it's interesting to watch the reaction to people, the reactions that people have to change. And the reactions, the really emotional, visceral reactions that people had to that farm being sold off. And it's hard as, human beings, we don't like change.
Right.
We like things to stay the same, especially if it's our home and we grew up there. But, that's the sort of thing where there's no way to solve that particular problem.
No, change comes no matter what.
Change comes no matter what.
And no matter where you're at.
Right. Yeah.
So
I think that's what makes our job challenging and rewarding, is figuring out what can we hold on to, what can we carry with us into the future, what can we show people that will help them understand kind of where Issaquah came from.
Yeah.
So.
It's really important. It's really important to know, where, at what point was this town like this, and this, because in 30 years from now, who knows what it's going to be like, and somebody look back and say, wow, we were a dairy farm in community at one point. That's amazing, because the only remnant will be probably Pickering Barn.
Right.
Will be the only remnant left at that point. So we're post World War II. Where are we at? We're post World War II. So let's maybe emphasize the bridge a little bit,
right?
And because I think that was I don't know, but I'm assuming that was a huge deal when the bridge.
I-90 was even bigger. Pretty much all of the changes that Highway 10 brought to Issaquah were sort of intensified by Interstate 90. So if this was a larger freeway, it was a wider freeway, it took up more space.
And when did I-90 come through?
Early 1970s.
Okay.
I can't remember the date specifically, but it's in the 1972, 73, 74 area.
Okay. So when the first Lake Washington Bridge was built, and when was that?
1940.
1940. Excuse my ignorance. Which one was first? 520 or I-90?
I-90.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
520 came later.
Okay. 520 was I-90 was first, and then that led right into Highway 10. So that was just Highway 10.
That was part of the Highway 10 project. Yeah.
Okay. So
that bridge.
What was that bridge called at the time? Do you know? I'm
sorry.
I
can see the brochure in my mind,
right?
But I can't remember the name.
Right. I think I can see it. I think I've seen that brochure as well.
Yeah. Beautiful blue.
Yeah. With the picture of the bridge on it.
I don't remember the official name of it.
Okay. So that opened in the 40s for Highway 10, which gave everybody east-west access through the Cascades. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. But it was the 2-lane highway until the 1970s.
Right.
Okay.
One of the things that Highway 10 did for Issaquah was gave it sort of a roadside culture. So if you've ever driven on
kind of like Route 66.
Right, yeah. So, of course, not quite that iconic, but you started seeing little roadside hotels cropping up and little burger stands, and of course this is when Bohm's got its start.
Oh, okay.
Because Bohm's was right there on the highway, and you had to pass it to go east and west, and so this was a high point for people traveling from either side of the mountains, because you'd stop and you'd get some chocolates and Bohm's, because it was this fabulous place and it was kind of part of the trip.
Was Triple X part of that too?
Triple X, that actually was constructed in the 30s, so it was a little before Highway 10.
Okay, but
it was on Highway 10.
Right. I mean, it was part of that culture as well,
yes.
but it wasn't built for Highway 10,
right.
but it would just happened. So at one side of the street, you'd go have lunch, and then you go across the highway and go get some chocolates before you hit the mountains or when you came out of them, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. That's pretty interesting. for my person, because I grew up in the Northwest, I always knew we always would drive by the Triple X. And when I drove by the Triple X, I knew basically it was the last spot. I mean, it was a mental marker for me, because we had family on the east side of the mountains, so it was just kind of like this mental marker. Oh, we're almost into the mountains,
right?
And as a little kid, it just seemed like we'd already been driving for hours.
Oh yeah.
So it was, even though I wasn't in Issaquah, we never really visited Issaquah. We went to Triple X maybe a couple of times. We'd pull off the road, but it was always, even though I wasn't part of the community, it was iconic in my mind as just a road, like you said, that roadside culture of being right there. So
the other thing that people tie in together with that memory is seeing the parachutes coming down over by the skyport.
Right.
So the skyport was a business that basically taught people how to skydive, and they had a huge presence here. And actually, in 1963, the World Parachute Championships were held in Issaquah.
Wow, impressive.
So that's one of our little claims to fame. So that's another thing that people remember is seeing the parachutes and seeing the people coming down from the airplanes. And like you, a lot of people that I know who never lived in Issaquah but lived in the Pacific Northwest as kids, those are their memories too.
Right.
Driving through chocolate parachutes, that's Issaquah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Sorry, I sidetracked you.
No, that's fine.
But
I like sidetracks.
Yeah.
So we already kind of have this car culture has been developing, and of course it's developing all over the country. And by the time we get to the early 70s, that's when I-90 came through. So as I was saying, I-90 was pretty much just intensified most of the changes that had come through with Highway 10. So it was wider, it was more lanes, so it again cut into area farms and took more property than Highway 10 had. It also was too wide to go underneath the trestle. So today, where Highway 18 stretches across I-90, prior to 1974 or so, there was a huge railroad trestle. And that's where the train would go up and then disappear on its way over to, High Point and points east. It was always a great place for kids to, risk their lives by running across the trestle or put pennies out to get squashed or grease the trestle to see if the train could still get up the ride. I heard a lot of stories about people hopping the train to go down to Alexander's Beach, which is on Lake Sammamish. So that was a very big thing, I think, for kids growing up here, is having the railroad as the backdrop to their childhood.
Right.
That's a really iconic thing. So that sort of hooks the loss of the trestle into a lot of people's memories. Because if you grow up in an active railroad town, that's something that you hear the trains going by, you hear the whistles in the distance.
Right, and you have this huge iconic trestle that goes, you almost identify your community with that, right? Yeah. And now there's historical pictures.
Right, and it's interesting how many pictures people took of the trestle as it was being deconstructed. This was really it's a sort of a fascination.
Oh, that's funny.
So that was a big change, of course. And then I-90 pretty much just intensified all the development because this opened up access a little bit more. It made it a little quicker to get here. And so the continuing drive to purchase property and develop it just sort of continued from there, and kind of continued to accelerate. So as all this change was happening, of course, at this point, like I said, the biggest population change at that time period was between about 1960 and 1970, when the population more than tripled. So this was a huge transformation for this little tiny town, and the people living in it who were used to living with roughly 1,000 other people that they pretty much knew and were probably related to in some way if you traced all the lines back far. So suddenly we've got a lot of people moving in from the outside, and you might go to a restaurant and you might see a few people there you don't know, and that's a new thing, it's hard to think of that now, but if you imagine going somewhere and you pretty much knew everybody all the time until everybody started moving out here. So that started creating a lot of different changes within the community, and a lot of growing pains.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of the time period when the Issaquah Historical Society was founded, because there were people who were beginning to panic because the town where they'd grown up was changing really quickly, and some of it was becoming unrecognizable. So, of course, as this development starts happening, as people start buying up property to develop, a lot of the old structures that were here start disappearing. They're being torn down so that people can build on the land, because the land is becoming more valuable than the property. So one of the properties that was razed that caused some panic was in 1970, the house that had belonged to Dr. W.E. Gibson was torn down. So Doc Gibson was this sort of classic character from Issaquah. If you've ever watched, any Old West TV show or Little House on the Prairie or anything like that, you've got this iconic Doc figure.
Right.
And he's always helpful and he's kind and he's sensible. Well, that was Doc Gibson. That's who he was. He moved here probably in the 1870s when it was really very much a frontier. And he doctored all kinds of people for all kinds of conditions. I mean, he sewed back on fingers, he took care of gunshot wounds, he delivered babies, he handled burns. There were so many articles in the Issaquah Press where, the closing line was, and Dr. Gibson showed up and patched the patient up and went home kind of thing. Yeah,
so literally that iconic Old West, you can't pay me with a chicken type of guy.
And he was known for being a very good horseman. He was also known as an amateur horticulturist. And he and another fellow named P.J. Smith, who, again, was a, upstanding citizen, landowner, they kind of took turns being mayor. It was one of those things that, no one really wanted to do it. It was like, I'm sure if you've gone to any sort of committee or board meeting when they're looking for, who wants to head up the committee? And, suddenly everyone's looking at their cell phones very intently. So Doc Gibson was a stand-up guy, and he and this other fellow kind of took turns being the mayor for a while. And so his house was slated to be torn down in 1970, and the house did end up getting torn down. This was not a fancy Victorian mansion, because Issaquah just didn't have that much social stratification. Right. But it was a fairly nice house, and it was a leading citizen. And so this is something that really hit people. And we have to thank a high school student from that time period who circulated a petition to save the ginkgo tree, which is outside, which is right near what was Doc Gibson's house. So the ginkgo tree was actually planted by Doc Gibson. This was one of his little horticultural experiments that he had. And so when the house was slated to be torn down, this student circulated a petition, and they saved the tree, which is fabulous. I think it's on the list of Issaquah treasures, and I get lots of interesting questions about it. So I think it's great that piece of Doc Gibson's hobby is still here for us to talk about and look at. And I'd like to remind kids when we're talking about it that if a high school student could save this tree, that's something to think about, and that your words and deeds and actions have some impact on the community. So that was one of the kind of sad/happy stories. Another thing that happened sort of through a similar chain of events, there was a house on Front Street that had been converted into a little shop. It was a consignment store called Country Mouse. And a lot of craftspeople and artisans in Issaquah, a lot of women, would create little consignment things and take them down and sell them, and they would make a little money off of this. So the woman who operated the shop was named Betty Konarski, and when a lot of this, when they were going to construct Safeway, what is now Staples, was originally a Safeway. And so this store, this house, the Country Mouse, was in front of the Safeway, and the owner went to Marvin Mole and Ruth Mole, who owned a chunk of property, and Marvin Mole had planned on developing another strip mall, like a lot of the other strip malls that were being developed. And Betty Konarski and then a friend of hers, I can't remember the first name, but her last name was Gray, they talked to Marvin Mole and said, I know you want to develop this strip mall here, you want to have some shops, but what about this? What about if you took this building that they're going to tear down, that's got a history, and you move it over here, and I can have my shop over here, and, we'll save a house, you'll have a shop, it'll be interesting and different. And so this idea evolved, and they decided to do it. And I've talked to Ruth Mole about this, and they really had no idea what they were getting into. Because, when you start moving historic buildings and then trying to maintain them, it's really challenging. It's very expensive to maintain a historic building. So this became sort of a labor of love. And all of the buildings, some people don't realize this if they've just moved here or maybe they've been here a while and just don't know. But all of the buildings in Gilman Village, except one, have their own history from somewhere else in the valley, and they were, taken up and relocated.
So that was the first house of Gilman Village. Country Mouse was the first one. And that's still in Gilman Village?
The building is no longer the Country Mouse, but the building is in Gilman Village, and it's across from the boarding house restaurant. I don't remember what shop is in it now, but it's
and this is just a sidebar. Do you do any kind of walking history in Gilman Village to talk about the history of each house, or no? Or
no, we do history hikes, and one of them ends at Gilman Village, so it talks a little bit about the Gilman Village story. But we haven't really embraced the idea of doing a full Gilman Village tour, because the story, it's hard to tell a story. It's more, each building is sort of a snapshot of someone's life. But it's hard to kind of weave it together. So it is fun to go through there, especially with...
Now, I don't know, does each location have a little history about the building or no? Or do they?
Yeah, each of them do. And I know they've got kind of a flyer that has the history of all the buildings that they distribute over there. We've also got all the buildings on our soon to be reintroduced to the world website. So probably by the time this is on the air, we'll have that back up, and people can go read the histories of any of the buildings.
And it's a good resource for any kind of Issaquah history, or at least get you pointed in the right direction. Go to your history website. What's that website?
IssaquahHistory.org.
Oh, okay. Get a little plug in there. It's good. That's good. So now I-90's been built. We've tripled population, so what, around 2,100, 22, 3,000?
Well, in 1970, the population was 4,313.
Okay. How many streetlights do we have?
I don't know about that. I think we were...
just funny, just an aside. Inside city parlance, it was always how many streetlights was how big the city. I worked here when there was one streetlight. Somewhere in my office, I've got a chronology, because that is one way to, That's how people, if you talk to older residents, they say, I remember when there was one streetlight in this town.
Well, and when I tell people that I grew up in a town that was a lot like Issaquah, only about 20 years behind, because we just got our first street light about 10 years ago. So, it is a way of gauging the age, sort of maturity of a community.
It's funny.
So, or at least its busyness.
So in 1970, we had 4,000 people, so it's basically officially a bedroom community of Seattle. So a lot of those 4,000, a good percentage now, have moved in. They work in Seattle, or maybe Renton or Bellevue and something like that, and they do a daily commute. So we're basically a suburb now, right? And then from the 70s on, is that just basically suburban growth at that point?
A lot of it is, and I think it can become difficult to talk about recent history in some ways, because we aren't really sure yet what it means. So we're just starting now to kind of get a sense of what Issaquah was like in the 80s and the 90s, because we're starting to have a little more perspective to look back on it. But I think really since the 1970s, a lot of the story of Issaquah has been growth.
Just growth.
More people coming in, and the city and its residents kind of trying to figure out what is that going to mean for Issaquah.
And the story is still, it's unwritten. It's written every day. It's written every day. So the interesting thing, because we've kind of went from the inception to kind of where we are now, is that that all the characters, and there's so many characters and stories inside this time period, and I'd love to get into some of those, at some point. But I just felt like this would be a good idea to get a general information out there, get it kind of how Issaquah grew from a coal mining town to basically suburban America, and I'd love to go back and talk about some of those unique characters, like the Dr. Gibsons of the world, and the first female mayor, and some of those things, some of those characters that really created the fabric of it, and some of the families, the Pickerings, I mean, why was that barn saved?
Right.
What happened to the Skyport?
Yeah, that could be a whole.
When did is paragliding part because of the Skyport? Was that all part and parcel of together? Because that's an iconic part that's maybe held over. So there's so much history in this little community, and I think that people just don't realize that. All these towns start from somewhere.
Yeah.
And
that's really a lot of what we want to do is be able to provide people with a sense of connection to Issaquah's past. Because there's still so many remnants of it and signs and signals if you know where to look for it.
Right.
Things like, for me, a few years ago when the Issaquah was voting on a bag ban, and there were a number of activists who had come out from Seattle and wave their signs around. And I just remember thinking at the time, with a historical perspective, thinking, I really can't think of a time in the last 120 years when people from Seattle came out to tell Issaquahns what to do, and Issaquahns were excited about that. That was one of the things that occurred to me as I was marching around.
A complete sea change on that. Back then it would have been, this is our little town, this is our little corner of the world. You stay out of it, right?
I'm not sure how many people felt welcoming of that or not. Maybe it was my own personal. Right. I took a bit of umbrage on Issaquah's behalf because I thought, Issaquah doesn't need somebody from Seattle to come tell them what to do. So,
that's great. That's great.
It's really interesting to look at the relationship between Issaquah and Seattle, and sort of the attitude that Seattle newspapers had when they were writing about Issaquah and vice versa. And that's sort of a universal thing, I think. I've talked to other people who grew up in small towns, and there's always the assumption that, small town people probably aren't as sophisticated and probably aren't as smart as people in the city.
Right. Yeah, of course. The country bumpkins and that sort of thing. Oh, we're going to go into the big city type of mentality. Yeah, that's unfortunate. Because it's not true. It's not true.
It's not at all. Well, and one of my favorite instances of that happening was in the late 30s when the Issaquah Alpine Dairymen were playing a football team. And these guys were 165 pounds and under. They were scrappy, and they worked full-time all week, and this is what they did on the weekends. And somebody from Seattle, they'd won the championship something like 6 years in a row, and someone from Seattle called the manager of the Alpines and said, we're going to, big talk, we're going to come over and clean your clocks. And yada, yada. Well, they lost. They didn't even score on the Alpines.
Oh, nice.
So those are kind of things where you feel a little community pride.
Saying, definitely.
Well, Issaquah told Seattle where to go. And,
Well, that's great. Well, this is great. I want to have you back because I want to talk about things like the Alpine football team, like the sports in our community, the early politics in our community, and some of the cast of characters that helped develop who we are today. If people want to know more about Issaquah history, how do they go about it? What's the best way to do it?
Best place to start out is probably our website at issaquahhistory.org. If you want just a nice basic introduction to Issaquah's past, you can spend a little time at the Gilman Town Hall Museum. That's especially great for kids. It's got a bunch of different hands-on activities, and that'll give you kind of a nice sense of Issaquah History 101.
Great. Oh, that's great. Well, thank you for coming again. Look forward to the next time, and we'll dig a little deeper in some of these interesting facts and historical happenings here in Issaquah.
Sounds great. I'm going to bring my shovel.
Well, this has been Uniquely Issaquah. Thanks for joining us, and stay unique.